Operations Research Analyst for the U.S. Army, and he's also a doctoral student at the New England College of Business, as is our other speaker as well. They're both students of the doctoral degree, and I will go ahead and you've got quite a bit here. So Stephen earned degrees in operations research from looks like from West Point, United States Military Academy, and Florida Institute of Technology. He's a certified Lean Six Sigma black belt through the U.S. Army, and a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt candidate with the U.S. Army. He's also a CQPA, Certified Quality Process Analyst.
She wrote the book that got me through the certification.
And the Certified Quality Improvement Associate, and a former U.S. Army infantry officer. And I don't have a whole lot to say because I don't have the bio for Lois, but I do know he's in the aerospace industry and had been in the U.S. Air Force, and he's also, like I said, a candidate as well. So, thank you.
Okay.
Real quick, how's the temperature?
I turned it off actually because it was a little cool. Some people were complaining with it.
Okay.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. I would tell you that it's a pleasure to be with you, but more fundamentally, it's a surprise to be with you. I was planning on being in a poster session this week, and then on Wednesday afternoon, I got a phone call saying, hey, would you like to bump up to be a formal, actual presenter? And being the masochist that I am, I said yes. So I'm looking forward to being done with this and getting some sleep in the near future.
Thank you.
I am, of course, a doctoral student at ASQ, so yeah, this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart because it's a topic that I'm still in early stages of dissertation research on, and anything you all can give me insights on as we go, I would certainly appreciate. So how I got involved in this whole public sector performance measurement thing, I got started, at least the wheels in my head started turning back when I was a middle school track and cross country coach in Kentucky. And I started asking myself after the first season, is there a way that I can start measuring the performance of my team and my athletes? And could that measurement system not only help me know how my students are doing or my athletes are doing, but also could it help motivate them? And so I started asking some of these questions, what are the types of outcomes that I'm hoping to achieve? What are the behaviors that I'm looking to promote? What are the metrics that might promote those behaviors? What data is out there that would help inform that? And certainly, what are the risks associated with it using a system like this? And so I came up with my own little MVP, most valuable player points system for my teams, and the kids actually fully embraced it, and it was great. I was during the track and field season. I was rewarding kids if they just found a way to contribute. I wanted you to be one of my top 5 athletes in something, because every fat little 6th grader thinks that they're going to be the next Usain Bolt, and even if they're not, they just want to not have to do anything hard, because even the fat little 6th grader can be done with the 100-meter dash in 20 seconds and it's over. Hey, I did my thing, but they may not be good at that. So I wanted them to find something that they would be good at. I wanted to certainly reward improvement as the season went on, and I certainly wanted to reward excellence. Any points that they got in a track meet were points that they also got for their own MVP system. Then during cross country, I had a similar type of approach, had a similar system, but then I also had this little thoroughbred club. So this is Kentucky, and this is the self-proclaimed horse capital of the world, and so. These kids thought that they were chasing a t-shirt, and I gave them times that they were looking for as boys, girls, and depending on your grade, and they were chasing this t-shirt. What they didn't realize was they were actually chasing a time that was strategically selected based off of the recent years of state finals in cross country, would have got them in the top 50%. If I get a whole team of kids that are, statistically speaking, in the top 50%, not only are they doing good, but I might actually have a team that's able to play. So this is how I kind of got started in all this. It kind of got the wheels spinning in my head. 10 years later, I'm doing Lean Six Sigma for the Department of the Army and an R&D lab out at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and definitely seeing some of the challenges with performance measurement and even getting people to adopt anything similar to a culture of performance management and measurement. And then, of course, being a doctoral student at NACB, I started doing more and more research on this and seeing more and more GAO, government accountability reports on this topic, and realizing that this is definitely an enduring problem. So today I just want to, as quickly as possible, because then we have another presenter, talk about where we are with public sector performance measurement, how we got here, and what's ahead. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take you on a quick journey through 10 pieces of either legislation or presidential initiatives that shaped where we are, and we're going to start at the bottom and work up. 1921, so this is nearly 100 years ago. It's pretty interesting, kind of the timing here, was the Budget and Accounting Act. So we are just after World War I. We are facing huge increases in the federal government spending, and that needed to be gotten under control. And up until this point, every agency, federal agency, submitted their budget request to Congress independently. So if I'm the Department of Defense, when I have a need, I submit something to Congress. Congress reviews and approves as necessary. When the budget is exploding like this, they needed to be able to see the government budget as a whole. So what they did was consolidated the entire budgeting process into a single document that gets submitted to Congress. It's calendar driven. It's the same process we have in place 100 years later. And it also was very instrumental in consolidating power of the president. There was a question about who should be coordinating all of this. Should this be the president or the secretary of the treasury? In this case, they ultimately decided, and I think rightly so, that it should be the president, just because the president actually had the power to negotiate the inevitable conflicts when people were competing for limited resources. So this got our wheels spinning, got the gears turning on being able to at least see the budget as a whole as a first step towards performance measurement. The weakness here is certainly the fact that budgeting was very, very inconsistent and typically was just reporting inputs. That's all they were really saying. Lists of here are all the people that I have working for my agency, just the categories of employees and such. Thereafter was the Budget and Accounting Procedure Act of 1950. Once again, we were in a post-World War environment. Once again, we have huge budget problems and the recognition that we need to get the budget under control. We can see the entire budget better in the sense of we know what the total expenditures are by each agency, but they didn't have a whole lot of visibility into what was actually being bought with that money. So for them to make some of those decisions about what should and shouldn't be a function of government, they wanted to see now not just what you were spending inputs, but they also wanted to see the activities that your organization was doing. So they changed some of the language, definitely changed the way information was presented to Congress to give them better insight, and it certainly helped with being able to see the budget a little bit more. It created some problems because there's always never the ability to do any true apples to apples. People define things differently along the way. Certainly no strong emphasis on outcomes. Like I said, they used the word activities, the activities that the organizations were doing. Part of their emphasis on activities rather than outputs or outcomes was the fact that the president at the time was harping very strongly on outcomes and outputs. So they said, well, we don't really need to worry about that. The president's got that aspect of it covered. Naively forgetting the fact that the president comes and goes. His initiatives come and go. And so the only thing that actually has sticking power, if you will, is the legislation. So what you see now are on these next three are three presidential initiatives that did come and go. So under the Johnson administration, we had the planning, programming, budgeting system. This was a very mechanistic approach that said if we know long-term requirements, planning, and we can trace the activities that are associated with that programming, and then the annual requirements that you have for funds, the budgeting activities, we can trace that all the way down and connect performance and budget together. Was a great idea. It was based off of what the Department of Defense had just put in place recently, but the problem was the DoD had spent over a decade trying to develop and perfect the system they got at least somewhat working for their organization. And then the government promptly took a one-size-fits-all approach and said, hey, everybody, literally, you have 6 months to get your own program established. Here's your model from the Department of Defense. It was, of course, destined for failure. Even a couple years into the implementation there, all the organizations that were using it were reporting all sorts of problems. We didn't have the right information systems. We did not have the ability to even figure out what our metrics should be. We didn't have the ability to analyze that information and certainly not to use it in decision making. So there was a lot of problems there, and one of the big problems with a lot of these initiatives was that it wasn't a substitution for something that the government was already doing. It was an adding on. So it was a huge increase in the reporting burden, and the staffs that were trying to implement this were having all sorts of problems. The only thing that I would say that was good about this was that it did give us we still have our standard interest rates and discounting procedures. Once the president left, though, so did this initiative. Similarly, we have the Nixon administration with management by objectives. Here we have, because of the previous President Johnson's his Great Society initiatives, huge increase to the size of the federal government. 50 new programs were added in a 3-year time frame, and there was clear recognition that the executive branch was struggling to be able to coordinate and control all of those activities like they had historically. So they needed an approach that would actually help them to manage for results, but at the same time not be super labor intensive. So management by objectives was picked up from private industry. The term was actually initiated by Drucker back in the day, and it was almost almost an informal performance management type of approach. You know, if you have your subordinate, get together with them, let's negotiate what the high-level goals are for your organization, and then at that point, turn them loose to work on it, and we'll get together every 2 months and simply review how you're doing, and just that face-to-face frequent feedback is now actually starting to say we care about more than just budgeting, we care about the results that you're producing. So accountability is finally introduced here, which was a great step forward. And they were trying to minimize the reporting burden, but here's the problem. If Jim and I are the two that are supposed to be having this talk air together, but Jim's busy. He passes the task off to somebody else, and that somebody else is now subordinate staff. Suddenly, what was a talk now becomes all the paperwork problems that this talk was supposed to alleviate. So yeah, inevitably it just became this ballooning implementation burden there. One other problem with this was the fact that goals were always one-year goals, and it made it a very poor assumption that you could have good goals that were short-term for complex federal agencies. You know, when you got a mission that might take years to actually see some sort of progress on, and oh, by the way, when that thing, whatever the result was, transpires finally in 10, 15 years from now, how much of that was because of you or because of the myriad other factors along the way that were clearly outside of your control? So yeah, some of the structure of the goal setting here was a little bit difficult and unrealistic. Once again, a president walked out the door, in this case prematurely, and so did this initiative. Okay? Next was zero-based budgeting. So this is the Carter administration. President Carter had campaigned on the idea of I'm going to balance the budget, and so he had apparently implemented zero-based budgeting in Georgia previously, and to some degree of success. So he was going to bring that to the federal government, and unfortunately, well, let's talk a little bit about what zero-based means. It meant that essentially we no longer are letting you just take a look at last year's budget and slightly adjust up or down. You know, very often that's your base. Last year I requested $10 million. I'm only going to request $10 million adjusted for inflation this year. There's nothing to see here. That's one approach. The zero base was saying, hey, if we truly have to get our expenses under control, then we are no longer making assumptions that we owe you anything. You come in with a zero base and justify to us everything that's within your budget here, and including, if necessary, removing things from your budget that you did last year that you no longer need to be doing this year. So it also asked organizations to be giving not just what they needed, but also alternatives. If we gave you more money, what are the difference in the level of results that you could achieve for us? Similarly, if we didn't give you the full $10 million that you're asking for, tell us how much you think you would need and what that would buy for us as far as results. So it did start trying to limit or associate, again, performance and the budget there. So there's a good linkage there, but it's still very mechanistic, a heavy reporting burden, and once again, was an initiative that had mixed results, and the president walked away, and so did the approach. Finally, things started to change in 1990 with the Chief Financial Officers Act. I'll point to this quote down here at the bottom first. This is GAO reporting to Congress. If I were to summarize in just a few words the environment in 2005 as compared to 1990, this is reflecting after 15 years now of this law being in place. Financial management has gone from the back room to the boardroom. So this was seen as a true pivot point in federal performance management. It finally gave the ability to have more apples to apples comparisons and dependable data. So in 1990, when this was happening, there was so much fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement that there was almost a spirit of despair in a lot of Congress about doing performance management and even financial management. What was ironic about this, at the same time that these federal agencies are saying that their finances are so complicated and so unique to them that you really can't have like standard one-size-all accounting types of procedures that apply to them and everything, they were doing the same thing to the states. So if a state was receiving federal funding above a certain amount, that state had to abide by some certain financial principles and submit themselves to an annual financial audit. The very sorts of things that the federal agencies were saying that really couldn't be done at their level. So, so the Chief Financial Officers Act declared 23 federal agencies, which is now 24 federal agencies that would have, not only you have to have a CFO, but more importantly, you have to be abiding by what is now generally accepted accounting procedures, and actually greatly increase the quality of our financial data. So if you think about performance budgeting, at least the budgeting piece of it would have some relatively reliable data. Now this is slow to be implemented. We're still having problems even today. I mean, a lot of those problems came from the information systems that people were using, the financial systems in particular. Even to this day, there was a 2018 report by the GAO. There are still federal agencies that cannot pass an annual audit by the GAO. And not just they can't pass, they can't even get an audit finding from the GAO. Like we look at your books and they're so undependable that we refuse to even give you a yes or no, pass, fail type of rating. And the Department of Defense is actually one of those, sadly. So a lot of our problems here with auditability, but still at the same time, it's aggressively started moving the government in the right direction and has had an enduring legacy there. So again, that said that was for the budgeting portion of performance budgeting. The performance aspect of performance budgeting really got initiated with the Government Performance and Results Act, GPRA, of 1993. This was an act that was put to really start forcing agencies to do strategic planning and performance management and the use of that information in their decision making. And the thing that was great about this one was that it really stood on the shoulders, if you will, of all the work that had gone into it previously. So, the previous 70 years of experience were really incorporated into the implementation of this. For instance, the bill was passed in 93, enacted in 97, and your reporting on your accountability type of report wasn't even enacted until 2000. So it was a slow, intentional, methodical implementation period, including multiple OMB-led pilot studies across the federal government. If you thought you had an interesting performance management challenge, whether that would be figuring out what your strategic objectives are, whether figuring out what your metrics are, how you were going to collect that sort of data, they were helping all these agencies do some pilot studies to try to solve those problems before anybody was actually being held accountable. So sadly, although it did increase the generation of performance information, in particular output, efficiency, customer service, quality, and outcome types of metrics, which were great, it did actually fail to increase their use in decisions. And I will point you to some of those problems here as we go forward. So the next was the program assessment rating tools. So this is a few years into the implementation of GPRA, and the Bush administration adopts this tool that you can still go online and find the results for. So every federal agency that was being evaluated would report their own data here to this website, and you can still pull up all these results. It's a great website, a great asset. But their objectives were certainly to have this common reporting framework by which we could actually start forcing the organizations to start using the information in their decisions. The problem was it did force the organizations to report more, including on what had already happened, but it didn't actually result in anybody doing much of anything with the information. It was still just passive performance information reporting. It was just simply about accountability. I'm just going to give you what you're asking for here. There's some evidence that it did influence the president's budget process, but as far as what Congress was doing with the information, no effect. And sadly, and more importantly, the federal agencies that were collecting and generating that data and theoretically using that to govern their behavior weren't doing that very activity. They were just reporting on what they had done. So this was terminated after President Bush left office, largely ignored by Congress, but still, you can get these scores online. And one thing I would point here is that a lot of the research that was done related to the program assessment rating tool started coming out essentially as it was finishing up. So, 5 or 6 years worth of implementation, and only late in its use, right as it was expiring, did people start actually being able to finalize some of the studies that they were doing on parts. So it's just a kind of a reminder here that sometimes we may need to be willing to be patient with the findings that are out there, with the studies that are out there, that even something that may be questionable might still have use, and it may take a little bit longer than we thought it should have. The GPRA Modernization Act was enacted during the Obama administration, so they were recognizing, again, performance information use was low. So here they were doing things like to align the planning with presidential cycles. It used to be every 3 years you put out a 5-year plan. Presidents come in every 4 years. Why don't we just make this a 4-year plan? They said we want to help people focus their effort. If we just collect information on everything, eventually we just have a bunch of noise and nobody's actually paying attention to any of it. So they said, hey, we want you, the agencies, to focus on high-level goals for your organization, and the president was even declaring some cross-agency priority types of goals to help people focus as well. One thing that was great about this was it did help organizations with the reporting burden. They were asking people explicitly, tell us each year anything that you are still reporting to Congress or to whoever up the chain that you think was unnecessary or duplicative, and those would be evaluated, and if at all possible, they would take action to reduce that reporting burden. There is evidence here that the processes that were called for by the Modernization Act, things like agency priority reviews on a quarterly basis and such, they would actually improve performance and information use, but still the question is whether those agencies would in fact abide by those processes. The process works, but do we work the process? And very often the answer to that was no. Its legacy, certainly we have chief operating officers and performance improvement officers enduring within these organizations. We still have all these processes in place, and there's still the performance.gov website where you can get a lot more information on this, a central data source. One last piece of legislation to be aware of, this happened late last year, was the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. 3 objectives: strengthen privacy of data, so whatever they collect, we'll make sure that it's not necessarily attributable to Stephen Reagan. At the same time, though, increase data access for research. They wanted to have a single place where you could go, put in your request for the type of study that you're wanting to do, why you need this information, what sort of information you're going to need, and how you're going to use it and such. And then ultimately enhance evidence building capacity within federal government. So certainly institutionalized some roles here, like chief data officers, chief data officer councils, chief evaluation officer. So now organizations actually have strategic plans and on their evaluations, basically their learning agendas. And this is, I think, a big shift that has happened. This started out as performance budgeting. That's where a lot of this measurement came. But eventually, even by the GPRA and the GPRA Modernization Act, you see we're still using some budgeting types of language, but what they're really just asking for is, can you demonstrate to us that you are trying to use performance information to govern your own decision-making processes? And this is another foundation for that. The learning agendas in particular, saying what sort of information do you need in order to run your organization well? Weaknesses, in my opinion, this is still based largely on the general framework of the idea that if I have the information, I'll automatically use it. And history has definitely proved that that's not the case. The presence of information does not equate to use of it. So what we do with it is kind of up to us going forward. So when I put all that together, there's a bunch of shifts that happened over time. We shifted from just we need to have more information to we need to have the right information. We've gone from focusing just on inputs to now outputs and outcomes. At the same time, recognize that the limitations of those sorts of approaches. One size fits all typically fits few. So customize our performance management approaches, focused on initially just the planning piece. Tell us what you're gonna be doing, what your objectives are, but with no follow through, no accountability. That changed over time. So now we're actually focusing not just on the planning, but on the results. We've gone from collecting information to using information. We've gone from just strict accountability. Again, performance budgeting is almost an accountability type of approach, to now saying we care less about the performance budgeting and just more that you are using information in your decisions and trying to be wise in the use of your federal funding. We've gone from budgeting now to learning, gone from the control of data to now the sharing of data. Certainly, again, with security and privacy concerns in place, but now that there's less of this stovepiped hoarding of data and fear-based control. And then, again, as I mentioned before, this short-term focus is transformed now into a little bit more of an idea of patience and long-term perspective. So the future here, I would say there's certainly going to be regard for increased context-specific interplay between metric selection, use, misuse, benefits, and risks. Misuse being things like gaming. People start using the information sometimes very intentionally, sometimes accidentally, but wrongly within their organizations. The National Academy for Public Administration talks about these last three things, that they're expecting increased use of data analytics to enable decision making. They're actually calling for more of a measurement system of design that's actually bottom up rather than top down. Top down seems to not really scratch the itch for people at the bottom of the chain, hence the lack of use of information in decision making. So they're thinking that a bottom up approach might be more appropriate. And again, we've seen this trend here of performance measurement being not so much about accountability as it is a tool for learning to drive improvement. So with that, I am done, and I submit my